Question 1. The efficiency study reveals that certain log sources within the IBM security QRadar SIEM environment are generating a high volume of data, impacting storage capacity and processing performance. The administrator is tasked with optimizing resource utilization. Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency gains with regulatory compliance and security monitoring requirements? Option A. Immediately disable logging for any log source identified as non-critical by the efficiency study to free up resources, assuming that regulatory requirements primarily focus on critical systems. Option B. Conduct a detailed impact assessment for each log source to determine its criticality for security monitoring, compliance reporting, and forensic analysis. Based on this assessment, selectively adjust logging levels, data retention policies, or data forwarding for less critical sources, ensuring all changes are documented and approved. Option C. Postpone any changes to logging configurations until a future, more comprehensive security audit is scheduled, to avoid disrupting current operations and to gather more data. Option D. Rely solely on the default QRadar logging configurations and vendor best practices for data retention and volume management, without performing an independent assessment of the organization's specific security and compliance needs. Correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed impact assessment for each log source to determine its criticality for security monitoring, compliance reporting, and forensic analysis. Based on this assessment, selectively adjust logging levels, data retention policies, or data forwarding for less critical sources, ensuring all changes are documented and approved. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for operational efficiency with the imperative of maintaining robust security posture, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing data protection and incident response. The QRadar SIEM administrator must make critical decisions that directly impact the organization's ability to detect, respond to, and report security incidents, all while adhering to compliance requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough and documented impact assessment before implementing changes that could affect security monitoring capabilities. This aligns with the principles of risk management and due diligence expected of security professionals. Specifically, it ensures that any reduction in logging or data retention is justified by a clear understanding of the potential security implications and is implemented in a manner that minimizes exposure, thereby adhering to the spirit and letter of regulations that require organizations to maintain adequate security controls and audit trails. An incorrect approach that involves immediately disabling logging for non-critical systems without a formal assessment fails to uphold the principle of least privilege and adequate security controls. This could lead to regulatory violations if an incident occurs and the necessary audit trails or forensic data are unavailable, hindering investigations and potentially breaching data breach notification requirements. Another incorrect approach, which involves relying solely on vendor recommendations without internal validation, abdicates professional responsibility and may not account for the organization's specific risk profile or unique regulatory obligations. This can result in non-compliance if the vendor's recommendations do not fully address the organization's specific legal and regulatory environment. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying the assessment indefinitely, creates an unacceptable security risk and demonstrates a lack of proactive security management, potentially leading to significant compliance failures and reputational damage if a security incident occurs during the delay. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape and the organization's specific compliance obligations. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk assessment for any proposed change, including a detailed impact analysis on security monitoring, incident detection, and forensic capabilities. All decisions and their justifications must be thoroughly documented. When changes are implemented, they should be phased, monitored, and validated to ensure they do not negatively affect the security posture or compliance status. Question 2. The performance metrics show a slight increase in CPU utilization on the QRadar SIEM console, coinciding with the release of a new security advisory detailing a potential vulnerability in a component of the V7. 3.2 platform. The advisory does not explicitly state that the vulnerability is actively being exploited in the wild, but it does indicate a potential for unauthorized access if exploited. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the administrator to take? Option A. Initiate a formal impact assessment to determine the specific risks to the QRadar SIEM environment and plan remediation. Option B. Monitor the system for any signs of actual exploitation before taking any action. Option C. Immediately apply the latest available patch for the QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Platform to address the vulnerability. Option D. Temporarily disable the affected component to prevent potential exploitation until a patch is available. Correct answer is A. Initiate a formal impact assessment to determine the specific risks to the QRadar SIEM environment and plan remediation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an administrator to balance the immediate need for system stability and performance with the long-term implications of security vulnerabilities and potential data breaches. The administrator must make a judgment call on the acceptable level of risk, considering the potential impact on business operations, regulatory compliance, and customer trust. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting performance metrics in the context of a security advisory, which often involves a degree of uncertainty regarding the exploitability and impact of the vulnerability. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured and informed decision-making process aligned with established IT governance and security principles. By initiating an impact assessment, the administrator is systematically evaluating the potential consequences of the vulnerability on the QRadar SIEM environment and the organization's data. This includes identifying affected components, assessing the likelihood and severity of exploitation, and determining the potential business and regulatory ramifications. This proactive and analytical approach ensures that any remediation actions are proportionate to the risk and that decisions are defensible and documented. This aligns with general principles of IT security management, which emphasize risk-based decision-making and due diligence in protecting sensitive information. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the advisory due to perceived low immediate impact is professionally unacceptable. This failure represents a significant ethical and regulatory lapse. It demonstrates a disregard for the organization's security posture and a potential violation of data protection regulations, e.g., if the QRadar system handles personally identifiable information or other sensitive data. Such an action could lead to a breach, resulting in financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer confidence. It also signifies a failure to uphold professional responsibility to maintain the integrity and security of the systems under their care. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately applying a patch without proper testing, is also professionally unsound. While seemingly proactive, this can introduce new system instability or performance degradation, potentially disrupting critical security monitoring functions. This hasty action, without understanding the specific impact on the v7. 3. 2 environment, could inadvertently create new vulnerabilities or operational issues, undermining the overall security objective. It bypasses essential change management processes, which are often mandated by regulatory frameworks to ensure system stability and prevent unintended consequences. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear, documented workflow. 1. Acknowledge and record the security advisory. 2. Initiate a formal impact assessment to understand the vulnerability relevance and potential consequences for the specific QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Deployment. 3. Consult vendor documentation and support for guidance on the vulnerability and potential remediation steps. 4. Evaluate the risk based on the assessment findings, considering factors like exploitability, data sensitivity, and business criticality. 5. Develop a remediation plan that may include patching, configuration changes, or compensating controls, prioritizing based on risk. 6. Test any proposed changes in a non-production environment before deploying to production. 7. Communicate the plan and any potential downtime or impact to relevant stakeholders. 8. Document all actions taken and decisions made for audit and future reference. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive approach to configuring log sources with an IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. To ensure effective security monitoring and compliance. Given a scenario where an administrator needs to optimize log collection from various network devices and applications, which of the following approaches best balances security visibility, system performance, and resource utilization while adhering to potential regulatory requirements for audit trails. Option A. Implement a granular logging configuration for each log source, prioritizing verbose logging for high-risk and compliance-critical sources and reduced logging for less critical sources after consulting with security and compliance teams. Option B. Randomly select a subset of log sources to receive verbose logging and ignore the rest to distribute the processing load evenly. Option C. Disable logging for any log source that is not directly involved in a current, active security investigation to conserve storage space. Option D. Configure all log sources to send the maximum possible volume of logs to QRadar to ensure no event is ever missed, regardless of its relevance or the system's capacity. The correct answer is A. Implement a granular logging configuration for each log source, prioritizing verbose logging for high-risk and compliance-critical sources, and reduced logging for less critical sources after consulting with security and compliance teams. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical constraints of storage and performance. The administrator must make a critical decision about log source configuration that directly impacts the security posture and operational efficiency of the QRadar deployment. The challenge lies in understanding the implications of different logging levels on incident detection capabilities, forensic analysis, and the overall health of the SIEM system, all while adhering to potential regulatory requirements for data retention and audit trails. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased and risk-based methodology. It begins with a thorough understanding of the organization's specific security policies, compliance mandates e.g., PCI DSS, HIPAA, GDPR, if applicable to the exam's implied jurisdiction, which is U.S.-centric for C1000-026, and the criticality of each log source. By prioritizing log sources based on their potential to reveal security incidents or compliance violations, the administrator can make informed decisions about logging levels. Implementing a granular approach, where only essential events are logged at a verbose level, and less critical events are logged at a reduced level or excluded, optimizes resource utilization without compromising essential security visibility. This aligns with best practices for SIEM management, ensuring that the system is both effective and sustainable. The principle of least privilege can be applied to logging, ensuring that only necessary data is collected. Incorrect approach is analysis. Disabling logging entirely for certain log sources, even if they are deemed less critical, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action creates blind spots in the security monitoring capabilities, making it impossible to detect or investigate potential security incidents originating from those sources. From a compliance perspective, many regulations mandate the logging and retention of specific types of security events. Disabling logging for these sources would directly violate such mandates, leading to potential fines, legal repercussions, and reputational damage. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in protecting organizational assets and sensitive data. Implementing a blanket verbose logging level for all log sources, without regard for their criticality or the SIEM capacity, is also professionally unacceptable. While it might seem like a better safe than sorry approach, it leads to overwhelming the SIEM with irrelevant data. This can degrade performance, increase storage costs unnecessarily, and make it harder to identify genuine security threats amidst the noise. This approach is inefficient and can lead to missed critical alerts due to system overload, which is a failure in providing adequate security monitoring. It also fails to adhere to principles of efficient resource management, which are often implicitly or explicitly part of IT governance frameworks. Failing to consult with relevant stakeholders, such as security operations teams, compliance officers, and application owners, before making logging configuration changes is another critical failure. Security decisions should be collaborative. Without input from these groups, the administrator risks making choices that either undermine security objectives or create compliance gaps that others are responsible for. This lack of consultation can lead to misaligned security strategies and operational inefficiencies, demonstrating poor professional judgment and a disregard for organizational collaboration. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, risk-based approach to SIEM log source configuration. This involves 1. Understanding requirements, Clearly define security objectives, compliance obligations, and business needs. 2. Risk assessment. Identify and prioritize log sources based on their potential impact on security and compliance. 3. Granular configuration. Configure logging levels for each source based on its risk profile and the value of the data it generates. 4. Stakeholder consultation. Engage with relevant teams to ensure alignment and gather necessary input. 5. Testing and validation. Regularly test the effectiveness of logging configurations and the SIEM ability to process the data. 6. Continuous improvement. Periodically review and adjust logging policies as threats and requirements evolve. Question 4. The performance metrics show an increasing trend in disk utilization and a slight degradation in event processing latency across the IBM Security QRadar SIEM deployment. The administrator is tasked with optimizing log collection to alleviate these issues while ensuring continued security visibility. Which of the following actions best represents a strategic approach to address these performance concerns while adhering to best practices for SIEM management? Option A. Disabling all non-essential log sources immediately to reduce the data ingestion rate and free up system resources. Option B. Enabling verbose logging on all remaining active log sources to capture maximum detail for potential future analysis. Option C. Increasing the polling interval for all log sources to reduce the frequency of data collection. Option D. Reviewing the configured log sources to identify and disable those generating low-value or redundant security events, prioritizing the collection of logs critical for threat detection and compliance. The correct answer is D. Reviewing the configured log sources to identify and disable those generating low-value or redundant security events, prioritizing the collection of logs critical for threat detection and compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical constraints of storage and performance. The administrator must evaluate the effectiveness of current logging configurations against established security best practices and regulatory requirements, without compromising the system's ability to detect and respond to threats. The professional challenge lies in making informed decisions about log source configuration that are technically sound, operationally efficient, and compliant with relevant security frameworks. The correct approach involves a systematic review of log sources, prioritizing those that provide critical security telemetry aligned with known threats and compliance mandates. This aligns with best practices for SIEM tuning, which emphasize collecting high-fidelity data that directly supports security operations and incident response. By focusing on essential logs, the administrator ensures that QRadar can effectively process, analyze, and store data relevant to security investigations, thereby maximizing its value and minimizing unnecessary overhead. This proactive tuning is crucial for maintaining system health and ensuring that security alerts are actionable and timely, which is a core tenet of effective security management. An incorrect approach of indiscriminately disabling log sources without proper analysis risks creating blind spots in security monitoring. This failure to collect necessary security events could lead to missed indicators of compromise, hindering incident detection and response capabilities. From a regulatory perspective, depending on the jurisdiction and industry, certain log data might be mandated for retention and audit purposes. Disabling these without a documented, risk-based justification could result in non-compliance, leading to potential fines, reputational damage, and legal liabilities. Another incorrect approach, such as increasing log verbosity across all sources without a clear security benefit, would lead to excessive data volume, draining system resources, increasing storage costs, and potentially diluting the effectiveness of threat detection by burying critical events in noise. This also represents a failure in efficient resource management, a key aspect of professional SIEM administration. Professionals should approach such decisions by first understanding the organization's security objectives and regulatory obligations. This involves consulting security policies, compliance frameworks, e.g., NIST, ISO 27001, or specific industry regulations, and threat intelligence. A phased approach to tuning, starting with high-priority log sources and gradually assessing the impact of changes, is recommended. Documenting all configuration changes, the rationale behind them, and their observed impact is essential for auditability and future reference. Regular review and recalibration of logging policies based on evolving threats and business needs are also critical components of a mature security operations program. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that a new industry-specific regulation mandates the logging and correlation of a specific type of financial transaction data within the SIEM, as the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Administrator, you need to implement the necessary configurations to ensure compliance. Considering the potential impact on system performance and the accuracy of existing security rules, what is the most professional and compliant approach to integrate this new data source and correlation logic? Option A. Immediately configure the new log source and correlation rules directly in the production QRadar environment to ensure the fastest possible compliance. Option B. Implement the new log source and correlation rules in production without extensive testing, assuming that any initial issues can be addressed reactively as they arise. Option C. Inform management that the current QRadar infrastructure is not capable of handling the new data requirements and recommend delaying compliance until a hardware upgrade is approved. Option D. Develop and test new log source configurations and correlation rules in a dedicated staging environment that mirrors the production setup. Once validated, schedule a maintenance window for deployment to production, including rollback procedures. The correct answer is D. Develop and test new log source configurations and correlation rules in a dedicated staging environment that mirrors the production setup. Once validated, schedule a maintenance window for deployment to production, including rollback procedures. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration where a new regulatory requirement impacts existing operational procedures. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for compliance with the potential disruption to ongoing security operations and the need for thorough testing. A hasty implementation without proper planning can lead to misconfigurations, false positives/negatives, and ultimately, a weakened security posture, which itself could be a regulatory violation. The administrator must navigate technical feasibility, resource constraints, and the critical need to maintain effective threat detection and response. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased implementation strategy. This begins with understanding the specific requirements of the new regulation and how they translate to QRadar configuration changes. It then moves to a controlled testing environment to validate the proposed changes without impacting the production system. This includes developing and executing test cases to ensure the new rules accurately detect the required events, do not generate excessive false positives, and integrate seamlessly with existing workflows. Communication with relevant stakeholders, including the compliance team and Security Operations Center, SOC analysts, is crucial throughout this process to manage expectations and gather feedback. Finally, a carefully planned rollout to the production environment, with rollback procedures in place, minimizes risk. This approach aligns with best practices for change management and risk mitigation, ensuring that regulatory compliance is achieved without compromising the integrity or effectiveness of the SIEM. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and a proactive stance in managing security infrastructure. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the changes directly in the production environment without prior testing is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses essential validation steps, increasing the risk of system instability, incorrect event logging, and missed security incidents. Such an approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on the organization's security posture and its ability to meet other compliance obligations. Ignoring the new regulatory requirement and continuing with the existing configuration is also a critical failure. This directly violates the new regulation, exposing the organization to potential penalties, legal repercussions, and reputational damage. It signifies a failure to adapt to evolving compliance landscapes and a dereliction of the administrator's responsibility to maintain a compliant security system. Implementing the changes without consulting with the SOC team or other relevant stakeholders is another professional failing. Security operations are directly impacted by SIEM rule changes. Failing to involve them means the new rules may not be understood, may generate unmanageable alert volumes, or may not align with their operational needs, leading to ineffective incident response and potential compliance gaps. This demonstrates poor communication and a lack of collaborative problem solving. Professional reasoning. Professionals in SIEM administration must adopt a risk-based, methodical approach to system changes, especially when driven by regulatory mandates. The decision-making process should prioritize understanding the full scope of the requirement, assessing the technical impact, planning for validation, and ensuring stakeholder alignment before any production deployment. This involves a continuous cycle of learning, planning, testing, and communication, ensuring that security and compliance objectives are met effectively and responsibly. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a comprehensive data loss prevention (DLP) solution would significantly reduce the likelihood of sensitive data exfiltration, but at a substantial upfront investment. A less expensive but less effective solution offers only moderate protection. The analysis also indicates that the potential financial and reputational damage from a major data breach, even with the less effective solution, could far outweigh the cost of the comprehensive DLP. Given these findings, what is the most prudent course of action for the organization? Option A. Deploy the less expensive, moderately protective solution to conserve immediate budget, accepting the increased residual risk. Option B. Implement a combination of basic security awareness training and network monitoring tools, as these are generally lower cost and can indirectly mitigate some data loss risks. Option C. Implement the comprehensive DLP solution, as the potential impact of a data breach significantly exceeds its cost, aligning with a proactive risk management strategy. Option D. Defer the decision to implement any DLP solution until future budget cycles, as the current investment is deemed too high. The correct answer is C. Implement the comprehensive DLP solution, as the potential impact of a data breach significantly exceeds its cost, aligning with a proactive risk management strategy. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity risk management, balancing the cost of implementing security controls against the potential impact of a security incident. The professional's task is to recommend a course of action based on a cost-benefit analysis, which inherently involves evaluating risks and their associated costs. The challenge lies in interpreting the analysis results and aligning them with organizational objectives and regulatory compliance, particularly within the context of the C1000-026 exam's implied jurisdiction, which, for the purpose of this exam, we will assume aligns with general U.S. cybersecurity best practices and common regulatory principles like those found in NIST frameworks, as no specific jurisdiction beyond the exam itself is provided. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the risk landscape and its implications for the organization. It involves not just the financial aspects, but also the potential impact on business operations, reputation, and regulatory standing. This holistic view ensures that decisions are not solely driven by immediate cost savings, but by long-term security posture and resilience. Adhering to established risk management frameworks, such as those that inform NIST guidelines, is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and compliance with potential regulatory expectations regarding data protection and incident response. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on the lowest immediate cost without considering the residual risk or potential for significant impact would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a false sense of security and leave the organization vulnerable to breaches that far exceed the initial cost savings. Such a decision could also violate ethical obligation to protect organizational assets and data, and potentially contravene regulatory requirements that mandate a certain level of security commensurate with the risks faced. For example, if a regulatory framework requires specific controls to mitigate a known high-impact risk, ignoring that requirement based on a narrow cost-benefit analysis would be a significant failure. Another incorrect approach might be to implement controls that are overly complex or expensive without a clear justification from the risk assessment. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the cost-benefit principle and can lead to inefficient resource allocation, diverting funds from more critical security needs. Ethically, it could be seen as a misuse of organizational resources. The professional decision-making process should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the findings of the cost-benefit analysis, including the identified risks, their likelihood, potential impact, and the cost of mitigation. 2. Evaluating the residual risk after proposed controls are implemented. 3. Considering the organization's risk appetite and tolerance levels. 4. Aligning the decision with relevant regulatory requirements and industry best practices. 5. Communicating the rationale clearly to stakeholders, justifying the chosen course of action based on a balanced assessment of costs, Benefits and risks. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal a significant discrepancy between the expected volume of security events being ingested into IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 3, 2, and the actual volume of events being stored and analyzed, leading to concerns about potential compliance gaps. Which of the following administrative actions best addresses this implementation challenge while adhering to regulatory requirements for log retention and analysis? Option A. Disable the collection of events from log sources identified as generating a high volume of data without a formal risk assessment or policy review to reduce the overall event load. Option B. Immediately increase the storage capacity allocated to the QRadar deployment to accommodate a higher volume of events, assuming the discrepancy is due to storage limitations. Option C. Review and adjust the event collection configuration for all log sources to ensure they are forwarding events as expected, and verify that the event processor is correctly configured to ingest and process these events, while also confirming that the configured retention policies align with regulatory mandates. Option D. Reduce the event retention period across the QRadar deployment to free up storage space and align with perceived immediate capacity needs. Correct answer is C. Review and adjust the event collection configuration for all log sources to ensure they are forwarding events as expected, and verify that the event processor is correctly configured to ingest and process these events, while also confirming that the configured retention policies align with regulatory mandates. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in SIEM environments, ensuring data integrity and compliance with regulatory requirements for log retention and analysis. The challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive security monitoring with the practical limitations of storage capacity and performance. A misconfiguration can lead to either insufficient data for forensic investigations and compliance audits, or excessive data that degrades system performance and incurs unnecessary costs. The professional challenge is to identify the root cause of the discrepancy and implement a solution that aligns with both technical best practices and the organization's regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation of the QRadar configuration related to event collection, processing, and storage. This includes verifying the event sources, ensuring that the correct log sources are enabled and properly configured to forward events to QRadar, and checking the event processor and storage configuration. Specifically, examining the event rate and the configured retention policies for events and flows is crucial. The professional best practice is to ensure that all relevant security events are being collected and stored according to the defined retention periods, which are typically dictated by regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services or healthcare data. This approach prioritizes data completeness and compliance, ensuring that the SIEM can effectively support security operations and meet audit requirements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply increase the storage capacity without investigating the root cause of the perceived data gap. This is professionally unacceptable because it fails to address the underlying issue, which might be a misconfiguration in event collection or processing. It also represents a potential regulatory failure if the actual problem is that critical events are not being collected at all, leading to non-compliance with data logging requirements. Ethically, it is a waste of resources and does not provide assurance of security posture. Another incorrect approach would be to reduce the retention period for events. This is professionally unacceptable as it directly contravenes regulatory requirements for log retention, which are designed to ensure that security incidents can be investigated and that compliance can be demonstrated. This action would lead to a direct regulatory failure and could result in significant penalties. It also undermines the fundamental purpose of a SIEM system, which is to provide a historical record of security-relevant activity. A third incorrect approach would be to disable certain log sources that are deemed less critical without a thorough risk assessment and documented approval. This is professionally unacceptable because it creates blind spots in the security monitoring capabilities. It represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it knowingly reduces the organization's ability to detect and respond to threats and to comply with data logging mandates. Such a decision requires a formal change management process and a clear understanding of the potential consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such discrepancies by first understanding the expected data flow and retention policies based on organizational requirements and applicable regulations. A structured troubleshooting methodology, starting with verifying data ingestion and processing, then examining storage and retention configurations, is essential. Documenting all findings, proposed solutions, and their impact on compliance and security posture is critical. Any changes should be implemented through a formal change control process with appropriate testing and validation. Question 8. Market research demonstrates that organizations often struggle to effectively prioritize security risks within their SIEM deployments. As a fundamental administrator for IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 3, 2, you are tasked with conducting a risk assessment for your organization's QRadar deployment. Which of the following approaches would best align with regulatory expectations and professional best practices for identifying and prioritizing security risks? Option A. Rely on the subjective opinions of the security operations team regarding which QRadar features are most likely to be exploited, without formal documentation or structured analysis. Option B. Systematically analyze QRadar's configuration, data sources, and integrations against known threat intelligence and vulnerability databases, and then assess the potential impact of identified threats on business operations to prioritize remediation efforts. Option C. Focus primarily on the most recent security alerts generated by QRadar, assuming these represent the most critical and immediate risks to address. Option D. Conduct a high-level review of QRadar's network connectivity and firewall rules, assuming that if the system is accessible, it is adequately protected. The correct answer is B. Systematically analyze QRadar's configuration, data sources, and integrations against known threat intelligence and vulnerability databases, and then assess the potential impact of identified threats on business operations to prioritize remediation efforts. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and operational efficiency. The administrator must identify and prioritize risks to the QRadar SIEM deployment, which is a critical component for security monitoring and incident response. The professional challenge lies in selecting a risk assessment methodology that is both effective in identifying significant threats and vulnerabilities and feasible to implement within the organization's capabilities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with established cybersecurity frameworks and regulatory expectations for risk management. A structured, systematic approach ensures that all relevant aspects of the QRadar SIEM are considered, from its configuration and data sources to its integration with other security tools and its role in the overall security posture. This methodical process allows for the identification of potential impacts and likelihoods of threats, enabling informed decisions about mitigation strategies. Adhering to recognized methodologies also demonstrates due diligence and compliance with potential audit requirements, which often mandate a documented and repeatable risk assessment process. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or the most visible security alerts fails to provide a comprehensive understanding of the risk landscape. This can lead to overlooking critical vulnerabilities or misprioritizing remediation efforts, leaving the organization exposed to significant threats that are not immediately apparent. Such an approach is professionally unacceptable as it deviates from best practices for risk management and could result in regulatory noncompliance if specific frameworks or standards are mandated. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the technical configuration of QRadar without considering the business context and potential impact of a compromise is also flawed. Risks are not purely technical, they have business implications. Failing to link technical risks to business objectives and potential financial or reputational damage means that the assessment may not accurately reflect the organization's true risk appetite or the urgency of certain remediation actions. This can lead to misallocation of resources and a failure to protect the most critical business assets. Finally, an approach that delegates the entire risk assessment process to a single individual without proper oversight or validation is problematic. Risk assessment is a collaborative effort that benefits from diverse perspectives and expertise. Relying on a single point of failure can lead to biases, incomplete analysis, and a lack of buy-in from other stakeholders. This approach undermines the integrity of the assessment and its effectiveness in driving security improvements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the organization's specific security objectives and regulatory obligations. 2. Selecting a recognized risk assessment framework, e.g., NIST SB 800-30 ISO 27005, that is appropriate for the QRadar SIEM environment. 3. Defining the scope of the assessment, including all relevant QRadar components, data sources, and integrations. 4. Identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities through a combination of technical analysis, threat intelligence, and expert judgment. 5. Analyzing the likelihood and impact of identified risks, considering both technical and business consequences. 6. Prioritizing risks based on their potential severity. 7. Documenting the assessment process, findings, and recommended mitigation strategies. 8. Regularly reviewing and updating the risk assessment to reflect changes in the threat landscape and the QRadar environment. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a desire for better visibility into security events within the QRadar SIEM environment. As a fundamental administrator, which of the following approaches best addresses this feedback while adhering to best practices and regulatory guidelines for log management and retention? Option A. Advise stakeholders that current logging levels are sufficient and that any perceived lack of visibility is due to user error in interpreting the data. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing log sources and event types to identify critical security events and compliance-relevant data. Prioritize the enablement of logging for these identified events, ensuring that log retention policies align with regulatory mandates and organizational security objectives. Option C. Implement a new, generic logging policy that captures all available event data from all log sources, without specific analysis of its security value or regulatory impact. Option D. Immediately increase the logging level for all log sources to the maximum verbosity to capture every possible event, assuming this will provide the desired visibility. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing log sources and event types to identify critical security events and compliance-relevant data. Prioritize the enablement of logging for these identified events, ensuring that log retention policies align with regulatory mandates and organizational security objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical constraints of storage, performance, and regulatory compliance. The professional challenge lies in interpreting vague stakeholder feedback and translating it into actionable, compliant logging policies. Careful judgment is required to avoid overlogging, which can lead to performance degradation and increased costs, or underlogging, which can result in compliance failures and missed security incidents. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of logging requirements against established best practices and relevant regulatory frameworks. This includes understanding the specific data elements needed for security monitoring, incident response, and audit purposes, while also considering the retention periods mandated by regulations. By prioritizing critical security events and ensuring that logging aligns with defined security policies and compliance obligations, administrators can achieve effective security monitoring without compromising system performance or incurring unnecessary costs. This approach is best professional practice because it is data-driven, risk-aware, and compliant. It directly addresses the stakeholder feedback by seeking to improve visibility without introducing new risks or violating established rules. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on increasing log volume without a clear understanding of what is being logged or why fails to meet the professional standard. This could lead to the ingestion of irrelevant data, increasing storage and processing costs without enhancing security posture. Furthermore, it risks violating data privacy regulations if sensitive information is logged unnecessarily or retained beyond its required period. Another incorrect approach, which involves ignoring the feedback and maintaining the status quo, is professionally unacceptable as it demonstrates a lack of responsiveness to stakeholder concerns and a failure to proactively manage the SIEM environment. This can lead to a perception of neglect and potentially missed security threats that could have been detected with improved logging. A third incorrect approach, which involves implementing logging based on assumptions rather than a structured analysis, is also problematic. This can result in logging the wrong types of events, missing critical indicators of compromise, or creating compliance gaps. Professionals should approach such situations by first clarifying the specific concerns behind the stakeholder feedback. This involves engaging in dialogue to understand what better visibility means to them. Subsequently, a thorough review of existing logging configurations, security policies, and applicable regulatory requirements, e.g., data retention, privacy laws, should be conducted. Based on this analysis, a prioritized list of logging enhancements can be developed, focusing on high-value security events and compliance mandates. This iterative process of analysis, implementation, and validation ensures that the SIEM environment is optimized for both security and compliance. Question 10. The control framework reveals that the security operations team is experiencing performance degradation and high storage costs within their IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Deployment due to an excessive volume of log data. To address this, the team is considering several strategies for optimizing log collection and retention. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices for managing SIEM resources while maintaining security posture and compliance? Option A. Implement a risk-based prioritization of log sources, focusing on collecting data from critical systems and high-value assets that are most relevant to the organization's threat landscape and regulatory obligations, while establishing clear data retention policies based on compliance requirements and business needs. Option B. Retain all collected log data indefinitely to ensure no security event is ever lost, regardless of storage capacity or the cost associated with long-term archival. Option C. Disable logging for all user endpoint devices and non-critical network devices to immediately reduce data volume without a detailed assessment of potential security implications or compliance gaps. Option D. Rely exclusively on the default log collection settings provided by IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. For all log sources, assuming these defaults are universally optimal for any organization's security and compliance needs. The correct answer is A. Implement a risk-based prioritization of log sources, focusing on collecting data from critical systems and high-value assets that are most relevant to the organization's threat landscape and regulatory obligations, while establishing clear data retention policies based on compliance requirements and business needs. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical limitations of storage and performance. In the context of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Effective log source management is paramount for both operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because administrators must make informed decisions about which log data is truly critical for security monitoring and incident response, while also considering the potential impact on QRadar's performance and the cost of data retention. Overlogging can lead to alert fatigue and increased infrastructure costs, while underlogging can result in missed security events and non-compliance with data retention policies. The correct approach involves a risk-based methodology for log source prioritization. This means identifying log sources that are most critical for detecting threats relevant to the organization's specific threat landscape and regulatory obligations. For example, logs from critical infrastructure, authentication systems, and high-value assets would be prioritized. This approach aligns with best practices for security operations and ensures that QRadar is configured to maximize its effectiveness in detecting and responding to security incidents. It also supports compliance by ensuring that essential audit trails are maintained. An incorrect approach would be to disable logging for entire categories of devices without a thorough risk assessment. For instance, disabling all logs from less critical user devices might seem like a way to save storage, but it could lead to the inability to investigate insider threats or endpoint compromises. This failure to log essential security events directly contravenes the principle of maintaining adequate audit trails, which is a fundamental requirement in many regulatory frameworks. Another incorrect approach is to retain all logs indefinitely without a defined retention policy. This not only incurs significant storage costs, but also makes it difficult to efficiently search for relevant data during investigations, potentially hindering incident response and increasing the risk of missing critical information. This approach also fails to adhere to data minimization principles and can lead to unnecessary data exposure. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on vendor defaults for log collection. While vendor defaults may offer a baseline level of logging, they are not tailored to an organization's specific risk profile or regulatory requirements, leading to either insufficient or excessive logging. A professional decision-making process for such situations should involve a systematic evaluation of each log source's contribution to security visibility and compliance. This includes understanding the organization's assets, the threats it faces, and the specific data retention requirements mandated by relevant regulations. Administrators should consult with security stakeholders, compliance officers, and IT infrastructure teams to gather input, implementing a phased approach to log source tuning, starting with critical systems and gradually expanding, allows for performance monitoring and adjustment. Regular reviews of logging configurations and data retention policies are essential to adapt to evolving threats and regulatory landscapes. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that the security team has limited resources for conducting comprehensive risk assessments across the entire IT infrastructure. Given this constraint, which approach to risk assessment would best align with regulatory expectations for a U.S.-based organization and demonstrate professional due diligence in protecting sensitive data? Option A. Conduct an in-depth risk assessment on every single system within the infrastructure, regardless of its criticality or exposure, to ensure no stone is left unturned. Option B. Allocate resources to assess systems based on how easy it is to find vulnerabilities, prioritizing those that require the least effort to document. Option C. Focus risk assessments on identifying the largest number of vulnerabilities, as this indicates a higher level of potential risk across the board. Option D. Prioritize risk assessments on critical assets and systems that support core business functions, focusing on known vulnerabilities and relevant threat intelligence. The correct answer is D. Prioritize risk assessments on critical assets and systems that support core business functions, focusing on known vulnerabilities and relevant threat intelligence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical limitations of resource allocation and the dynamic nature of threats. The challenge lies in prioritizing which assets and vulnerabilities to focus on when a complete, in-depth assessment of every single component is not feasible within the given time frame and budget. A failure to prioritize effectively can lead to misallocation of resources, leaving critical systems exposed or wasting effort on low-impact risks. This requires a strategic approach that aligns with organizational security objectives and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a tiered risk assessment methodology. This begins with a high-level identification of critical assets and their associated business functions. Subsequently, a risk assessment is conducted on these critical assets, focusing on known vulnerabilities and potential threat vectors relevant to the organization's industry and threat landscape. This approach is best professional practice because it ensures that the most significant risks to the organization's operations and data are addressed first. It aligns with the principle of proportionality in security, where resources are directed towards areas of highest potential impact. From a regulatory perspective, frameworks like NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is often a guiding principle for U.S.-based security practices, and relevant to the context of IBM QRadar in a U.S. operational environment, emphasize identifying and prioritizing risks to critical functions and assets. This approach demonstrates due diligence in protecting sensitive information and maintaining operational resilience, which are key tenets of many data protection and cybersecurity regulations. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on the number of vulnerabilities without considering the criticality of the asset or the exploitability of the vulnerability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach can lead to an inefficient allocation of resources, addressing minor issues on non-critical systems while leaving high-value targets exposed. It fails to demonstrate a risk-based approach, which is a fundamental expectation in cybersecurity governance and often mandated by regulations requiring risk management. Conducting a comprehensive, in-depth risk assessment on every single system, regardless of its criticality or exposure, is also an incorrect approach. While thoroughness is important, This method is often impractical and unsustainable due to resource constraints. It can lead to analysis paralysis and a failure to implement any meaningful security controls in a timely manner. Ethically, it represents a potential misuse of resources that could be better applied to more pressing security concerns. From a regulatory standpoint, it may not satisfy requirements for demonstrating effective risk management if it delays the implementation of controls for high-risk areas. Prioritizing risk assessment based on the ease of finding vulnerabilities rather than their potential impact or likelihood of exploitation is another flawed approach. This can lead to a focus on superficial issues and a neglect of more complex but potentially devastating threats. It demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking and a failure to understand the true risk posture of the organization, which is a critical failure in professional cybersecurity practice and can have regulatory implications if it leads to a breach of protected data. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves understanding the organization's business objectives and critical assets, identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, analyzing the likelihood and impact of those threats, and then prioritizing mitigation efforts based on the assessed risk level. This framework ensures that security investments are aligned with business needs and regulatory requirements, maximizing the effectiveness of security controls. When faced with resource constraints, the professional's judgment should be guided by a clear understanding of the organization's risk appetite and regulatory obligations, ensuring that the most critical risks are addressed first. Question 12. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in event processing latency and a corresponding rise in CPU utilization on the event processor, correlating with a recent increase in log source volume. Which of the following administrative actions is the most appropriate first step to address this situation? Option A. Disable all custom correlation rules to reduce processing load. Option B. Analyze the event processor's queue depth and examine the event rate from newly added or increased log sources to identify potential parsing or correlation rule inefficiencies. Option C. Provision additional event processor hardware to accommodate the increased log volume. Option D. Immediately restart the event processor service to clear any temporary resource contention. The correct answer is B. Analyze the event processor's queue depth and examine the event rate from newly added or increased log sources to identify potential parsing or correlation rule inefficiencies. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, interpreting performance data to identify and address potential issues that could impact security monitoring capabilities. The professional challenge lies in accurately diagnosing the root cause of performance degradation and implementing the most effective remediation strategy, considering the potential impact on log collection, event processing, and rule correlation. Careful judgment is required to balance the urgency of performance issues with the need for thorough investigation and minimal disruption to ongoing security operations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and data-driven investigation. By correlating the observed performance metrics with specific QRadar components and their known behaviors, an administrator can pinpoint the exact area of concern. This methodical approach ensures that remediation efforts are targeted and effective, preventing recurrence and maintaining the integrity of the SIEM security functions. Adhering to IBM's recommended troubleshooting methodologies and documentation is crucial for ensuring compliance with operational best practices and maintaining the system's intended functionality. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on restarting services without a proper diagnosis is professionally unacceptable. This is because it bypasses the critical step of root cause analysis. Restarting services might offer a temporary fix but fails to address the underlying issue, which could be a configuration error, a resource constraint, or a software defect. This can lead to recurring performance problems, increased downtime, and a false sense of security. From a regulatory perspective, failing to adequately investigate and resolve performance issues that impact the SIEM ability to detect and respond to threats could be seen as a failure to maintain a robust security posture, potentially violating compliance requirements related to security monitoring and incident response. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately scaling hardware resources without understanding the cause of the performance metrics is also professionally flawed. Hardware limitations can contribute to performance issues, Blindly adding resources is an inefficient and costly solution if the problem stems from software configuration, inefficient rules, or suboptimal data flow. This approach neglects the principle of efficient resource utilization and can mask underlying problems that require software-level adjustments. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence in troubleshooting and resource management. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured troubleshooting methodology. This includes 1. Clearly defining the observed problem based on performance metrics. 2. Consulting QRadar documentation and knowledge bases for known issues and troubleshooting guides related to the observed metrics. 3. Isolating the problem by examining specific QRadar components, e.g., event processors, flow processors, database. 4. Gathering relevant logs and diagnostic information. 5. Formulating and testing hypotheses for the root cause. And 6. Implementing targeted remediation steps, followed by verification of the fix and ongoing monitoring. This systematic approach ensures that solutions are effective, efficient, and aligned with best practices for SIEM administration. Question 13. Assessment of the most appropriate strategy for managing a critical application server log source that is generating an unusually high volume of event data, impacting the overall performance of the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Deployment and potentially jeopardizing compliance with data retention policies. Option A. Implement a global policy to reduce the logging verbosity of all log sources connected to QRadar by one level to uniformly decrease data volume across the entire SIEM. Option B. Continue to monitor the SIEM performance without making any changes to the log source configuration, assuming the system will eventually stabilize or that the issue is temporary. Option C. Conduct a detailed analysis of the application server's log output to identify specific event types or conditions contributing to the excessive volume, and then implement granular filtering or adjust logging levels on the application server itself to retain only relevant security events, while ensuring critical compliance data remains accessible. Option D. Immediately disable the collection of logs from this application server within QRadar to alleviate the immediate performance strain and prevent further data ingestion issues. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed analysis of the application server's log output to identify specific event types or conditions contributing to the excessive volume, and then implement granular filtering or adjust logging levels on the application server itself to retain only relevant security events, while ensuring critical compliance data remains accessible. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in SIEM environments, ensuring data integrity and compliance with regulatory retention policies without overwhelming system resources. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for comprehensive logging, as mandated by regulations, with the practical limitations of storage, processing power, and network bandwidth. Organizations must make informed decisions about what data to collect, how long to retain it, and how to manage it efficiently. Failure to do so can lead to non-compliance, security gaps, and operational inefficiencies. The specific challenge here is to determine the most effective method for managing log sources that are generating excessive data, impacting the SIEM performance, and potentially its ability to meet compliance requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, risk-based methodology for identifying and prioritizing log sources that are contributing to excessive data volume. This process begins with understanding the regulatory requirements for log retention and the specific security objectives of the organization. By analyzing the data generated by each log source, administrators can identify those that are either redundant, irrelevant to security monitoring, or excessively verbose. Implementing granular collection policies, such as filtering specific event ID or reducing the logging level on less critical systems, allows for targeted data reduction. This approach ensures that critical security events are captured and retained according to policy, while minimizing the impact on SIEM performance and storage. It aligns with best practices for efficient SIEM operation and demonstrates due diligence in meeting compliance obligations by focusing resources on the most valuable data. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disabling log collection entirely for any source, regardless of its perceived volume, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Regulations often mandate the collection and retention of specific types of security events. Arbitrarily disabling a log source without a thorough risk assessment and documented justification could lead to a failure to detect or investigate security incidents, violating compliance requirements, and potentially exposing the organization to legal and financial penalties. Implementing a blanket policy to reduce the logging level on all log sources without prior analysis is also professionally unacceptable. This approach risks discarding valuable security information from critical systems. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the specific security context and the varying importance of different log sources. Such a broad-stroke action could lead to blind spots in security monitoring, making it impossible to identify sophisticated attacks or meet audit requirements. Ignoring the excessive data volume and continuing with the current configuration, hoping the SIEM will manage, is a passive and irresponsible approach. This will inevitably lead to performance degradation, potential data loss, and ultimately, non-compliance as the SIEM struggles to ingest, process, and store data within its operational limits and defined retention periods. It signifies a failure to proactively manage the SIEM environment and address known issues, which is a breach of professional responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with SIEM administration must adopt a proactive and analytical decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape. Clearly define all applicable compliance mandates and their specific logging and retention requirements. 2. Asset and data inventory. Maintain a comprehensive inventory of all log sources and understand the type and volume of data each generates. 3. Risk assessment. Evaluate the security criticality of each log source and the potential impact of losing its data. 4. Data analysis. Regularly analyze log data to identify patterns, anomalies, and sources of excessive volume. 5. Policy development. Develop granular collection and retention policies based on risk and compliance requirements. 6. Continuous monitoring and optimization. Regularly review SIEM performance, storage utilization, and compliance posture to identify areas for improvement. This systematic approach ensures that data collection and management are aligned with both security objectives and regulatory obligations, fostering an efficient and compliant SIEM environment. Question 14. Comparative studies suggest that when faced with increasing storage costs and performance demands on an IBM security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Deployment. A fundamental administration's approach to managing log data retention and collection should be guided by a comprehensive understanding of its implications. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound and compliant strategy for addressing these challenges? Option A. Immediately reduce the retention period for all log sources by 50% to achieve significant storage savings and improve system performance. Option B. Disable logging for any log source that is not actively generating critical security alerts to reduce data volume. Option C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment that evaluates the security, operational, and regulatory compliance implications of any proposed changes to log collection or retention policies, prioritizing data essential for incident response and audit requirements. Option D. Focus solely on cost reduction by implementing the most aggressive log data filtering and retention policies possible, assuming that any necessary data can be reacquired if needed. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment that evaluates the security, operational, and regulatory compliance implications of any proposed changes to log collection or retention policies, prioritizing data essential for incident response and audit requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical constraints of storage, performance, and regulatory compliance. The professional challenge lies in making informed decisions about log data retention and filtering without compromising security visibility or violating audit requirements. The pressure to reduce costs or improve system performance can lead to decisions that inadvertently weaken an organization's security posture or create compliance gaps. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any changes are risk-informed and aligned with both business objectives and legal obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that considers the security implications, operational performance, and regulatory requirements before making any changes to log collection or retention policies. This aligns with best practices in information security and SIEM management, which emphasize a proactive and risk-based approach. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of data governance and security auditing, ensuring that log data necessary for incident detection, forensic analysis, and compliance reporting is preserved. In the context of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 3.2, this means understanding the data sources, their criticality, and the retention periods mandated by relevant regulations, e.g., SOX, HIPAA, PCI DSS, depending on the organization's industry and location, assuming a U.S.-centric regulatory environment for this exam. A well-documented impact assessment provides justification for decisions and facilitates future audits. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing changes without a formal impact assessment is professionally unacceptable due to several regulatory and ethical failures. One incorrect approach is to indiscriminately reduce log retention periods across all log sources to save storage space. This fails to consider that certain log types may have specific regulatory retention requirements, leading to non-compliance and potential fines. It also compromises the ability to conduct thorough forensic investigations for past incidents, weakening the overall security posture. Another incorrect approach is to disable logging for specific log sources based solely on perceived low security value without consulting security policies or compliance mandates. This can lead to blind spots in security monitoring, making it impossible to detect or investigate threats originating from those sources. It also violates the principle of comprehensive logging for auditability. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize cost savings over security and compliance requirements without a proper risk analysis. This demonstrates a failure to uphold professional responsibility to protect organizational assets and data, potentially exposing the organization to significant financial and reputational damage. It also disregards the ethical obligation to maintain a secure environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the current logging configuration and its purpose. This involves identifying all log sources, their criticality, and existing retention policies. The next step is to research and understand all applicable regulatory and compliance requirements related to log data retention and content. Before implementing any changes, a formal impact assessment should be conducted. This assessment should evaluate the potential security, operational, and compliance consequences of proposed modifications. The findings of the impact assessment should then inform the decision-making process, ensuring that any changes are justified, documented, and implemented in a controlled manner with appropriate stakeholder approval. Regular reviews and audits of logging policies and configurations are also crucial to maintain effectiveness and compliance. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 3.2 environment is experiencing performance degradation due to an excessive volume of log data. The administrator needs to reduce the logging load to improve system responsiveness and manage storage costs, while ensuring that critical security event data is not compromised. Which of the following approaches best balances these competing requirements and adheres to fundamental administration principles for QRadar? Option A. Continue logging all available data to ensure no security event is missed, and address performance issues by increasing hardware resources or optimizing QRadar's internal processing rules. Option B. Implement a phased approach to review and prioritize log sources based on their criticality to security monitoring, incident response, and regulatory compliance. Document the rationale for including or excluding each log source and establish a regular review cycle for these decisions. Option C. Disable logging for all applications identified as non-critical to immediately reduce the data volume, without further analysis of the specific security events generated by these applications. Option D. Randomly select a percentage of log sources across different application categories to disable, assuming this will distribute the performance improvement evenly. Correct answer is B. Implement a phased approach to review and prioritize log sources based on their criticality to security monitoring, incident response, and regulatory compliance. Document the rationale for including or excluding each log source and establish a regular review cycle for these decisions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration. balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical limitations of storage and performance. The administrator must make a judgment call on what constitutes critical security event data for effective incident response and forensic analysis, while also considering the impact on system resources and compliance requirements. The challenge lies in the subjective nature of critical and the potential for misinterpretation to lead to either insufficient data for investigations or excessive data that hinders performance and increases costs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review and prioritization of log sources based on their relevance to known threats, regulatory mandates, and business impact. This aligns with best practices for SIEM deployment and management, which emphasize a risk-based approach. By focusing on log sources that provide the most valuable security intelligence, the administrator ensures that QRadar can effectively detect, investigate, and respond to security incidents. This also supports compliance by ensuring that required audit trails are maintained without overwhelming the system. The decision-making process should be documented and auditable, demonstrating due diligence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disabling logging for all non-critical applications without a clear definition of critical or a documented risk assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach risks creating blind spots in security monitoring, making it impossible to detect or investigate certain types of incidents. It could violate compliance requirements that mandate logging of specific activities, leading to potential fines and reputational damage. Randomly selecting log sources to disable based on perceived low importance is also professionally unacceptable. This ad hoc method lacks a structured basis and can lead to the accidental disabling of crucial log sources. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the potential security implications of each log source and a failure to adhere to a systematic, risk-informed approach. Ignoring the performance impact and continuing to log everything indiscriminately, while seemingly safe from a data perspective, can lead to a degraded SIEM performance. This can delay incident detection and response, which itself can be a compliance failure if service-level agreements or regulatory requirements for timely response are not met. It also represents an inefficient use of resources. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM log source management by first understanding the organization's security objectives and regulatory obligations. A risk assessment should be conducted to identify critical assets and data. Log sources should then be prioritized based on their ability to provide visibility into these critical areas and their relevance to compliance frameworks. A documented policy for log source inclusion and exclusion, including a review process, is essential. When making decisions about disabling or reducing logging, a clear justification based on risk and impact analysis must be established and maintained. This ensures that security posture is maintained while optimizing resource utilization. Question 16. To address the challenge of optimizing IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Log source configuration for effective security monitoring and resource management. An administrator has been tasked with determining which log sources are critical for security event detection. The organization has a broad range of IT assets, but no explicit policy currently defines critical security events or mandates specific log sources beyond general compliance requirements. The administrator needs to make an informed decision on which log sources to prioritize for collection and analysis within the SIEM. Option A. Consult with security operations, IT infrastructure, and compliance teams to identify critical assets and potential threats. Then prioritize log sources based on their relevance to these identified risks and compliance obligations, followed by tuning event rules and parsers. Option B. Rely solely on the default log source configurations provided by IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Without any further customization or validation. Option C. Disable logging for all but the most obvious high-volume events to reduce storage and processing load, assuming that less frequent events are less likely to be critical. Option D. Implement logging for every single event generated by all systems and applications to ensure maximum data capture, regardless of its immediate security relevance. The correct answer is A. Consult with security operations, IT infrastructure, and compliance teams to identify critical assets and potential threats, then prioritize log sources based on their relevance to these identified risks and compliance obligations, followed by tuning event rules and parsers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive logging with the practical constraints of storage and performance. The administrator must make a judgment call on what constitutes critical security events without a clear, predefined policy. This ambiguity can lead to either insufficient visibility into potential threats or an overwhelming volume of data that hinders effective analysis. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the organization's security posture and risk appetite to make an informed decision that aligns with operational realities and regulatory expectations, even when explicit guidance is lacking. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of identifying and prioritizing log sources based on their potential to reveal security incidents. This aligns with best practices for SIEM deployment and management, which emphasize a risk-based approach. By consulting with stakeholders such as security operations, IT infrastructure, and compliance teams, the administrator can gain a holistic understanding of critical assets and potential threats. This collaborative effort ensures that the selected log sources are relevant to the organization's specific threat landscape and regulatory obligation. The subsequent tuning of event rules and parsers is crucial for filtering out noise and focusing on actionable intelligence, thereby optimizing SIEM performance and reducing storage costs without compromising essential security monitoring. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to effective security operations, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks that mandate robust security monitoring and incident detection capabilities. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disabling logging for all but the most obvious high-volume events without a clear policy or risk assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach creates blind spots, making it impossible to detect sophisticated or low and slow attacks that may not generate the most voluminous logs. Directly contravenes the principle of maintaining adequate security monitoring, which is a cornerstone of most data protection and cybersecurity regulations. Implementing logging for every single event generated by all systems, regardless of its security relevance, is also an incorrect approach. While seemingly comprehensive, this leads to an unmanageable data volume. This results in increased storage costs, degraded SIEM performance, and a significantly higher risk of missing critical alerts due to alert fatigue and the sheer volume of noise. This inefficiency can indirectly lead to noncompliance by hindering the ability to respond to incidents in a timely manner, a requirement in many regulatory frameworks. Relying solely on vendor default logging configurations without customization or validation is another failure. Vendor defaults are often generic and may not align with the specific security risks or regulatory requirements of the organization. This can lead to either insufficient logging of critical events or excessive logging of irrelevant data, both of which are suboptimal and potentially noncompliant. It demonstrates a lack of proactive security management and a failure to tailor the SIEM to the organization's unique environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM log source selection and tuning by first understanding the organization's risk profile and regulatory obligations. This involves engaging with relevant stakeholders to identify critical assets, potential threats, and compliance mandates. A phased approach, starting with high-priority log sources and gradually expanding based on demonstrated value and resource availability, is recommended. Regular review and refinement of logging policies and configurations are essential to adapt to evolving threats and business needs. This iterative process ensures that the SIEM remains an effective tool for security monitoring and incident response, supporting both operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. Question 17. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to optimize IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 3. 2. Resource utilization and storage costs while maintaining robust security monitoring and compliance. Given the diverse nature of log sources and varying regulatory retention requirements, what is the most effective strategy for prioritizing log collection and defining data retention policies? Option A. Collect all available logs from every system and application within the network to ensure no potential security event is missed, and retain all logs indefinitely to facilitate any future forensic investigation. Option B. Establish a uniform short-term data retention policy for all ingested logs, such as 30 days, to minimize storage costs and simplify management, regardless of the source or potential compliance implications. Option C. Implement a risk-based approach to log source prioritization, focusing on critical assets and compliance-relevant data, and establish tiered data retention policies based on the criticality and regulatory requirements of each log source. Option D. Disable logging for any system or application deemed non-critical by individual department heads to reduce the volume of data ingested and stored by QRadar. The correct answer is C. Implement a risk-based approach to log source prioritization, focusing on critical assets and compliance-relevant data, and establish tiered data retention policies based on the criticality and regulatory requirements of each log source. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM administration, balancing the need for comprehensive threat detection with the practical constraints of data storage and performance. Stakeholders, representing different business units or compliance departments, often have competing priorities. Security operations teams may demand extensive logging for forensic analysis and rapid incident response, while IT operations might be concerned about the cost and performance impact of excessive data ingestion and retention. The challenge lies in making informed decisions that satisfy these diverse needs without compromising security posture or operational efficiency, all while adhering to relevant regulatory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, risk-based methodology for log source prioritization and data retention. This aligns with best practices for SIEM management and is implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that mandate effective security monitoring and incident response. By focusing on critical assets, high-risk applications, and compliance-relevant data sources, organizations can ensure that the most valuable security information is captured and analyzed. Implementing tiered retention policies, where sensitive or compliance-critical logs are retained longer than less critical ones, optimizes storage costs and performance while meeting regulatory obligations. This approach demonstrates due diligence in security monitoring and data management, a key tenet of many cybersecurity regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. Collecting all available logs without discrimination is an inefficient and costly approach. It can lead to alert fatigue, obscure critical security events within a sea of noise, and significantly increase storage and processing overhead. This approach fails to demonstrate a risk-based security strategy, which is often a requirement for compliance. It also ignores the practical limitations of SIEM performance and scalability. Disabling logging for non-critical systems without a thorough risk assessment is also problematic. What is deemed non-critical can change, and certain seemingly minor systems might hold crucial forensic data in the event of a breach. This approach risks creating blind spots in the security monitoring capabilities, potentially leading to missed incidents and non-compliance with regulations that require comprehensive logging for all relevant systems. Implementing a blanket, short-term retention policy for all logs, regardless of their criticality or compliance relevance, is a direct violation of many data retention regulations. It prevents effective incident investigation, forensic analysis, and audits, leaving the organization vulnerable and non-compliant. This approach prioritizes cost savings over security and regulatory adherence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM log management by first understanding the organization's critical assets, business processes, and regulatory obligations. A risk assessment should guide the selection of log sources and the definition of logging levels. Subsequently, a data retention policy should be developed in consultation with legal, compliance, and IT stakeholders, ensuring that it meets both business needs and regulatory requirements. Regular review and tuning of log sources and retention policies are essential to adapt to evolving threats and business changes. This structured, risk-informed, and compliance-aware approach ensures that the SIEM effectively supports security objectives and regulatory mandates. Question 18. Compliance review shows that the security operations team has identified a gap in log visibility for a specific application, and a new, third-party log aggregation software has been proposed as a solution. The team is eager to implement this software quickly to address the perceived gap. What is the most appropriate next step to ensure the secure and effective integration of this new software with the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7? 3. 2. Environment. Option A. Deploy the new log aggregation software directly into the production QRadar SIEM environment to immediately address the log visibility gap and monitor its performance. Option B. Implement the new software in a separate, isolated environment and observe its functionality for an extended period before considering integration with the QRadar SIEM. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to evaluate the software's compatibility, resource requirements, security implications, and potential effects on the QRadar SIEM performance and stability before deployment. Option D. Prioritize the immediate deployment of the software to enhance log visibility, assuming that any potential issues will be minor and can be resolved post-implementation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to evaluate the software's compatibility, resource requirements, security implications, and potential effects on the QRadar SIEM performance and stability before deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. A critical challenge in this scenario is balancing the immediate need for operational continuity with the long-term security posture and regulatory compliance. The introduction of new software, even for a seemingly minor function like log aggregation, carries inherent risks. These risks can range from introducing new vulnerabilities to impacting the performance and integrity of the QRadar SIEM itself. The urgency to address a perceived gap in log visibility can lead to rushed decisions, bypassing essential security and impact assessment steps, which is a common pitfall in rapidly evolving security environments. The professional challenge lies in advocating for a structured, risk-based approach within potentially time-constrained operational demands. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves conducting a thorough impact assessment before deploying the new log aggregation software, represents best professional practice because it aligns directly with fundamental security principles and regulatory expectations for robust security operations. Comprehensive impact assessment systematically identifies potential risks to the QRadar SIEM confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This includes evaluating the software's compatibility with the existing QRadar environment, its resource utilization, potential conflicts with other QRadar components or integrations, and its security implications, e.g., data handling, authentication, potential for introducing new attack vectors. By performing this assessment, the security team can proactively identify and mitigate risks, ensuring that the new software enhances, rather than compromises, the overall security posture and the SIEM ability to meet its intended functions. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining a defensible security architecture and demonstrating due diligence in managing technological changes, which is implicitly expected by regulatory frameworks governing data security and incident response. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the software immediately without any prior assessment is professionally unacceptable because it represents a significant disregard for risk management principles. This approach bypasses critical security checks, potentially introducing vulnerabilities or instability into the QRadar SIEM. Such an action could lead to a compromised security posture, data breaches, or service disruptions, all of which carry severe regulatory and ethical implications, including potential fines and reputational damage. Deploying the software in a production environment and then observing its performance for potential issues is also professionally unacceptable. While observation is part of a broader strategy, initiating deployment without a pre-assessment is inherently risky. It places the QRadar SIEM and the data it protects at immediate risk. This reactive approach can lead to unforeseen operational impacts or security incidents that are far more costly and difficult to remediate than if they had been identified and addressed proactively during an impact assessment. It demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to adhere to best practices in change management and security deployment. Focusing solely on the perceived benefit of improved log visibility without considering the QRadar SIEM overall health and security is professionally unacceptable. Security is a holistic discipline. While enhanced log visibility is a desirable outcome, it must be achieved in a manner that does not undermine the foundational security and stability of the SIEM. This approach prioritizes a single objective over the comprehensive security and operational integrity of a critical security tool, which is a fundamental failure in risk-based decision-making. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, risk-based approach to any change impacting critical security infrastructure like QRadar SIEM. This involves a clear process. First, understand the business or operational need. Second, identify potential solutions. Third, conduct a thorough impact and risk assessment for each viable solution, considering technical compatibility, resource requirements, security implications, and potential operational disruptions. Fourth, develop a mitigation plan for identified risks. Fifth, plan and execute the deployment with appropriate testing and rollback procedures. And finally, monitor and validate the solution post-deployment. This systematic process ensures that changes are implemented safely, effectively, and in compliance with security, best practices, and regulatory expectations. Question 19. Consider a scenario where a critical security rule within IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.3.2 is generating a high volume of false positive alerts, impacting the ability of the Security Operations Center (SOC) to identify genuine threats. The rule is essential for detecting a specific type of attack, but its current configuration is overwhelming the SOC analysts. As the administrator responsible for QRadar, you have identified a potential configuration change that could significantly reduce false positives, but implementing it requires temporarily disabling the rule for a short period to test the modification in a controlled environment. However, your organization's standard operating procedure for any change to security rules, especially those related to threat detection, mandates a formal change request process, including a risk assessment and approval from the security manager, which can take several business days to complete. SOC is currently experiencing a surge in alert fatigue due to these false positives. What is the most appropriate course of action for the administrator? Option A. Implement the configuration change immediately without disabling the rule, hoping it resolves the false positives without impacting detection capabilities. Option B. Ignore the false positive issue and continue to monitor the rule, assuming the SOC will eventually adapt to the alert volume. Option C. Temporarily disable the rule for a brief, controlled period to test the configuration change, immediately document the action and the temporary workaround, and initiate the formal change request process concurrently. Option D. Permanently disable the rule to immediately alleviate the alert fatigue, with the intention of re-enabling it after the formal change request process is completed. The correct answer is C. Temporarily disable the rule for a brief, controlled period to test the configuration change, immediately document the action and the temporary workaround, and initiate the formal change request process concurrently. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the ethical obligation to maintain data integrity and confidentiality, while also adhering to operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. The administrator is tasked with a critical function that directly impacts the security posture of the organization, and any deviation from established protocols could have significant consequences. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for a quick resolution with the long-term implications of compromising security best practices. Correct approach involves meticulously documenting the incident and the temporary workaround, ensuring that the deviation from standard procedure is temporary and that permanent fix is prioritized. This aligns with best professional practices by upholding the principle of least privilege, maintaining audit trails, and ensuring that security controls are not permanently weakened. Specifically, in the context of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.3.2 fundamental administration, this approach respects the integrity of the SIEM logging and event correlation capabilities, which are crucial for detecting and responding to security threats. Regulatory frameworks often mandate accurate and complete logging, and any intentional or unintentional circumvention of these processes can lead to non-compliance. An incorrect approach would be to permanently disable a security rule or bypass a logging mechanism to resolve the immediate issue without proper authorization or documentation. This represents a failure to adhere to the principle of least privilege and could create a blind spot in the SIEM monitoring capabilities, leaving the organization vulnerable to undetected attacks. Such an action would also violate the principle of accountability, as it bypasses established change management processes and could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate audit trail. Furthermore, it could contravene regulatory requirements that mandate comprehensive security monitoring and incident detection. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the issue and hope it resolves itself, or is addressed by another team without explicit communication or escalation. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and proactive security management. It fails to acknowledge the potential impact on the organization's security posture and could lead to a delayed response to a critical security event. This inaction can be interpreted as negligence and a failure to uphold the duty of care expected of a security administrator. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the organization's security policies and procedures, as well as relevant regulatory requirements. When faced with an operational issue that impacts security controls, the administrator should first attempt to resolve it within established guidelines. If a temporary workaround is necessary, it must be fully documented, authorized, and time-bound, with a clear plan for a permanent remediation. Escalation to appropriate stakeholders, including security management and potentially compliance officers, is crucial to ensure transparency and informed decision-making. Question 20. The investigation demonstrates that, while numerous security alerts are generated by IBM Security QRadar SIEM, the security team struggles to prioritize remediation efforts effectively. They are considering several approaches to address this challenge. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a robust and compliant risk assessment methodology for a QRadar SIEM environment? Option A. Implement remediation for all identified vulnerabilities as quickly as possible, regardless of their potential impact or the resources required, to achieve a state of zero known vulnerabilities. Option B. Rely on the subjective judgment of senior security analysts to determine which alerts and vulnerabilities pose the greatest risk, based on their past experience and intuition. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that maps identified vulnerabilities and potential threats to specific business assets and data types, evaluating the potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then prioritizing remediation based on the calculated risk exposure and the effectiveness of proposed controls. Option D. Focus remediation efforts exclusively on the security alerts that have the highest frequency of occurrence within the QRadar SIEM logs, assuming these represent the most immediate threats. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that maps identified vulnerabilities and potential threats to specific business assets and data types, evaluating the potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then prioritizing remediation based on the calculated risk exposure and the effectiveness of proposed controls. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge in cybersecurity administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and operational impact. Organizations must identify, analyze, and prioritize potential security threats to their assets, including sensitive data managed by IBM Security QRadar SIEM. The challenge lies in determining the most effective and efficient method for conducting this assessment, without causing undue disruption or overlooking critical vulnerabilities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with established risk management frameworks and regulatory expectations for data security. A structured, evidence-based methodology ensures that risks are identified systematically, their potential impact is quantified, even if not purely mathematically, and mitigation strategies are prioritized based on their effectiveness and feasibility. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining compliance with data protection regulations and demonstrating due diligence in safeguarding information assets. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical vulnerabilities without considering the business context or potential impact fails to provide a holistic view of risk. This can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing minor technical flaws while ignoring significant business risks. It also neglects the requirement to understand the potential impact on data confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is a cornerstone of most data protection regulations. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or gut feeling rather than systematic analysis is professionally unacceptable. This method is subjective, prone to bias, and lacks the rigor necessary to satisfy audit requirements or justify security investments. It fails to provide a defensible basis for risk mitigation decisions and can leave the organization exposed to unforeseen threats. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes the most frequently reported incidents without a deeper analysis of their potential impact or root cause can lead to a reactive rather than proactive security posture. While incident frequency is a factor, it does not inherently reflect the severity of the risk. A low-frequency but high-impact event could be overlooked, leading to catastrophic consequences. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a phased approach. First, Define the scope and objectives of the risk assessment, considering regulatory requirements and business criticality. Second, identify potential threats and vulnerabilities relevant to the QRadar SIEM environment and the data it protects. Third, analyze the likelihood and impact of these risks, considering both technical and business perspectives. Fourth, evaluate existing controls and determine residual risk. Finally, prioritize mitigation efforts based on the assessed risk levels and available resources, documenting the entire process for auditability and continuous improvement.